Good morning. It's a great day. Hopefully everybody has recovered from last night and all of the great parties. It's good to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. Today we're going to spend some time talking about attack paths through AWS and how solving individual problems probably isn't the best course for actually addressing these. We're going to spend some time talking about why identity is the key across AWS in terms of the most preventative controls and making your entire AWS organization a showcase for amazing security. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about when you're actually doing your automated red teaming exercises or you're doing your pen testing in these AWS accounts, how you can get some hints to give the pen testers, maybe not to make their job easier, but to allow them to actually understand how your accounts are set up. When we go through this and we look at attack paths, which we've been analyzing for years, there's some interesting differences that happen in AWS or any cloud environment that are not quite the same as enterprise environments. And so when we look at all the different stages of an attack path, in every one of these stages, there are things we should consider differently. And so we can start with something as simple as reconnaissance. Of course, you have to do reconnaissance to figure out what you're going to attack, where you're going to laterally move next, all of those things. In AWS, a lot of the reconnaissance we see is actually with the actual identity permissions that are granted to the things that have been breached or exfiltrated or whatever they are. So they may be using things like, describe all the resources, list all of the resources to see what access they can get to. So you need to be monitoring those just like you would network reconnaissance type style attacks. The vulnerabilities are really interesting when we get to cloud providers. We all know we've been using vulnerability management for 20 years. We already have too many vulnerabilities. We have a million of them. When you're using the platform as a service style services, quite often there's a cocktail that's created of, we have a script that starts it up, it gathers an image, that image actually executes another script, it puts a bunch of packages on the system, that then gets executed in some autoscale group, EMR, whatever it is. All of those points in that cocktail introduce new vulnerabilities into the actual running workload. And sometimes it's really, really hard to get an agent on those boxes. And so we need to think about that when we're looking at our vulnerabilities that are there and what we're trying to protect against. When you actually get in, the soft center of your cloud is probably a little too soft, because if you're giving things like default roles, so the default Amazon roles, or you're giving them star, hopefully you're not doing that, you end up with a scenario where there's no resource restrictions on most of those roles. And because of that, they're open to the entire account that they're in. And because of that, it's really easy to use those default roles to gather and do things that maybe were not intended by that original resource. Lateral movement in cloud, of course, is often not done with networks. You can jump between accounts using trust relationships. You can steal an access key. If that access key has rights in another account, you can now jump accounts. Of course, you can get to workloads that way, secrets, things. Again, we need to look across all of that in lateral movement. And the exfiltration stuff gets really interesting. I have many customers that, we always kind of joke, they're the customers that deleted the internet from their cloud. They've cut every network path off possible. They've built all these great network controls. And yet very simple IAM controls like creating pre-signed URLs and creating pre-signed notebooks bypass a lot of those controls. So it's really easy for the attacker, once he gathers up enough permissions, to actually exfiltrate the data out. And so we need to be looking across all of those scenarios when we do this. Now, if you know anything about Sonrai, we're really big at making sure that you're protecting the crown jewels of your organization, right? What is the most sensitive data that you have sitting in AWS that you want to protect? And there's a reason for this. When you were kids, you sat in some restaurant, or your kids today do it, and there's a little map or a maze that they have to go through. And there's something at one side of it, and they're trying to get to the maze at the other side. And if you start at the starting point and try to get to the end, it's complicated, because you keep running into roadblocks. And that's what the attackers do. I try this vulnerability, I exfiltrate it, that's great, and I find out I have nowhere to go after that. And they try over and over and over and over again. However, if you've ever started at the end of the maze and worked your way to the front of it, it's a straight path every time, right to the front. Kids learn that pretty quick when they're about 4, actually. Same deal here. If you start with your most sensitive resources and work your paths backwards and say, well, what's every possible way you can access this single piece of data or this most critical resource? And you take all of those paths and you say, okay, Is there an unprotected key? Is there a toxic combination that would allow access on the other side of this? Is there an overprivileged identity that gets to it? Is there a vulnerability that would allow us to get to this point, to get through this path? The number of paths that you need to actually protect is much, much lower. Now, unfortunately, we're going to talk about red teaming and pen testing later in this. You'll still be embarrassed when they find vulnerabilities in here. But what you don't want them to be going to your manager with is the fact that they managed to get to here. I'm not supposed to walk in front of the screen, they told me, so I'll stop doing that when I point. Now, when I started down this journey almost 5 years ago now, it was all about the data. How do you access data? But there was a flip in my mind that happened as we started to work through Amazon. Everything in Amazon is controlled with the IAM policies that get written. And because of that, it is the kind of the most important way to secure your AWS accounts. Because you can stop almost anything from happening using an identity control in AWS or an account policy or an SCP. They're all the same type of language. And if you do this right, you can create an environment that's so much more secure than any enterprise data center you've ever built. It is amazing. And the reason why is this. You can see everything. There is a CMDB behind Amazon that is up to date 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You never miss a thing. It's there. You can monitor it. On top of that, you can actually get to least privilege in most cases. So in enterprise data centers, it was really hard to take an entitlement for a non-person identity or a person and say, okay, what do they do, what do they not do? Because the logs were all over the place. They weren't centralized in a way, and the permissions that they had didn't line up with the logs. In Amazon, these correlate almost perfectly. And so you can say, look, if I've been entitled to use all of these individual permissions, but I only use 3 of them, I can create a better policy to get to least privilege. And it's all within one boundary. It's really easy to do. The other thing is the risks no longer have to be siloed. So think about that attack chain through all the scenarios. You can actually bring all of this together now. You can see the vulnerability. You can see the network path. You can see the access through data, and you can see how it gets to sensitive data. And so we can actually control all this. But there's some interesting stats that I like to show. If you take Amazon over a year and you look at all the new permissions that they do, list bucket, create pre-signed URL, all these types of things. There are on average 5 new ones every single day. And some of them are mundane, list buckets. And some of them are really, really sensitive, create pre-signed URL or terminate account. You need to track those because some of those new ones that show up could be the way that somebody's going to exfiltrate data in the future. If you look at this, there's over 10,000 of these in AWS right now, and it grows every day. And some of them, when we actually start to look at them, there's combinations of them that allow you to privilege escalate your own role to other levels. And so you need to look at those combinations quite closely when you're actually doing this work to make sure that you never allow those. It's interesting, if you go back to the old school world, we used to do a lot of separation of duties work. These are kind of the same concept. You can't have a scenario where certain identities have combinations of permissions, because if they do, there's ways for them to privilege escalate. And so we work with a lot of customers to help optimize these types of things. The other thing that I love about Amazon and cloud in general is the fact that the non-people identities can be so much more secure than they ever were on-premise. On-premise, we used to have all these secrets lying around that we kept in CredStash and CyberArk and all these places. And they typically were fairly long-lived. They lasted a very long period of time. And because of that, if an attacker got them, they had a lot of time to use them across the environment. In Amazon and the other clouds, there are these great ways to have these very short-lived credentials using things like trust relationships and assumed roles and all of these types of concepts. And if you use those properly, you can really start to lock this down. However, you're giving them to your compute processes, all your workloads that are running. You're giving them to automation accounts. And the cloud services actually have permissions too, and the attackers know this. They can manipulate them that way. And so if you look at some stats, actually, you'll see that 95% of these kind of non-people identities, whatever they are, permissions aren't used. They don't use any of the permissions that are granted to them because we're too permissive with giving them star permissions, default roles, things like that. We're not locking them down. And because of that, about 81% of the breaches actually end up with an identity in the middle of the exploit. It's a great stat from an IBM paper from a couple years ago. So you look at this and say, well, how do I protect against this? And how does lateral movement work when it's not a key, when it's not a secret that's involved in the middle? Those are often the parts of the middle of these attacks, and you need to monitor that. But in Amazon, if you're doing things right, you're segmenting your workloads probably by account boundaries. And so you'll have a sandbox account, and you'll give your developers lots of rope in that account. You'll let them have star permissions. You'll let them do whatever they want. And you'll have production accounts, and in those accounts, you'll have everything locked down very well. We hope you will. However, in these scenarios, there are opportunities where something in these lower zones, sandbox accounts, development accounts, may have a trust relationship to something else like a SecOps account, an automation account, something of that nature. And these accounts may have access to other accounts or other trust relationships. And from there, they may be able to get into production. And if the attacker can find these paths, of course, now they can get to that sensitive piece of data at the end. One of the softest places in Amazon where this happens is the organization account. So if you have an organization account and you're not looking at every single trust relationship that can get in or out of that account and lock it down, there is a high possibility that something in one of these lower zones can get there somehow, use that account to then go to every other account within the environment. And, how would you delete everything in your entire org? That's how you would do it. So you certainly want to protect these paths very, very closely. So how do you fix this stuff? Clearly you still have to patch your vulnerabilities. We're not saying you don't. We have to look at all of them and understand that. You have to look at scenarios where you can't have network groups. I said, customers cut their Amazon accounts off from the internet. You still have to look at your security group. You still have to look at your peering. You still have to look at all these things. It's important to lock them down as much as you can. The trust relationships are key. You've got to actually optimize all those and see what's there. You've got to get to least privilege. However, there is a way to prioritize this. So let's go back to our data. And if we start to look at how you would do a red teaming exercise against one of these accounts, or actually against your whole organization, and you start with that piece of data and you find all of these paths to that piece of data, there will be certain points in that path where you can break it. You can break the connection, and it's probably unused. And you can use all of the data that you have in Amazon, those CloudTrail events as an example, to see what's used and what's not used and figure out where to break those paths. And so when you have a workload that maybe itself has a path to the network that allows it to get, to the whole VPC, or worse, the public internet can get to it. And you have a vulnerability on it, and the vulnerability can be breached. And it's tied to an identity, and that identity can do one of these trust hops to a production account. And that production account role it gets has access to sensitive data. And you take this whole path, and you give it to somebody like a pen tester and say, here's the places where this path exists. They now have a target map to start, okay, if I try to get to here, I try to get to here. People will sometimes say, well, we don't want to give them that. Well, you have to give them that. When we do pen testing, we actually give them the logs from our application servers because, again, when they hit the application and they cause errors, if you give them the logs, they know how to get to the next step. And it's very effective. The whole point you're paying these people for is so that they can get in. This will short-circuit a lot of their work so they can see where those critical paths are. So again, we do this. These are called amplifiers in the Sonrai world. We use them to basically take any one of these and we figure out how they're amplified and how those connections work. And we use them to prioritize all of the issues that you have. There's a lot of security vendors out here. Any one of us can probably find 100,000 things wrong that you've done in Amazon. It's pretty easy to do that usually. The question is, what are the 5 that you need to fix today, right? And this is where you use these amplifiers to get to those 5 things that you really need to fix today. So look, I'm going to summarize here quickly. We've got, at Sonrai, a booth over far end. You have to go through Alert Logic and through Sentinel-1, and we're on the other side. We do a lot of stuff around workload security, finding your vulnerabilities hidden in the corners of your AWS environments where maybe you don't have agents. We do some great API inspection to understand exactly how the cloud is configured and the state of your current cloud. We pull in all of your logs to see where we can break those chains and say, we're going to stop an attack here because you're not even using this permission or this trust relationship. And then again, we do some great stuff around data inspection to figure out where those crown jewels are so that you can wrap the protection around them. So again, some great stuff here. Again, would welcome you guys over to the booth today. I do have a prize for the people in the audience. A couple of Sonrai people over here that cannot have the prize. It's a pretty good one. I'm not going to show it to you. I got to go around the corner to get it. Um, does anyone here know what Sonrai stands for? And it's in a different language, if that helps. Ah, no one's going to get the prize. Does anyone have an Irish dictionary somewheres? That's terrible. Okay, I need a different skill testing question. How do you laterally move between accounts in AWS? Details? It's close to details. It's not quite details. It's Irish, not Gaelic. He's super close. He may get there. Data, you win. All right, hang on a second. I've got a prize around the corner. I was supposed to bring it out with me. Congratulations. It's actually a really nice Kodak foam printer. Good catch as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great show.